Great to see everyone this morning. Again, just another beautiful morning. Oh my goodness. We've had such a wonderful run of weather here during June when it can at times be 105, 110. So it's been so nice to have these wonderful, modest, moderate days. Great to see everyone this morning. And I'm going to take just a minute and give out some thanks to a number of people. And so the first thing I'm going to say, the first people I want to really express our Chico History Museum thanks to Bob and Mary Poland. And they have been bringing their box of donuts. Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's just become kind of a part of these events here, and I look forward to them, and I think many of us do. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
The donuts this morning are imported.
No, what?
They came from Redwood.
Whoa! Imposter donuts. Yeah, very good. Thank you so much. Then I want to just thank again a number of our Chico History Museum board members. And this is really a good group of people that keep the nuts and bolts of this Chico History Museum open and running. And we just lost one of our most precious, our most respected, our most appreciated board members, Chris Johnson. And Chris is just a wonderful human being who probably has taken on more in life than he can really keep up with. And the years pile up, and he has just had to make a difficult choice of stepping away here from the Chico History Museum. He's been one of our most versatile, our most knowledgeable, our most go-get-it-done people that we've had here, and we are all going to really miss him. And he has agreed to continue to be our custodian here. There's a better word for it, but what is that word? Conservator of the Chinese temple. With his parents, Keith and Karen Johnson, Chris knows more about this temple than probably anyone. And his their painstaking care for the temple, for setting it up, for cleaning it, for learning about it, it's just without comparison. So again, Chris will still be active, attach you as a conservator with the temple. Again, I'd like to highlight Dusty Galland. David Dusty Galland. This guy is amazing. He's a board member. He's got a new little registration stand right there to match our black walnut pieces we've already got.
He didn't like the white one we had, so we're going with the new, which is very attractive.
It's a he got the wood, I think, on Tuesday, and by yesterday he had this done. He's not only got the touch of design in his head where you can see all the pieces ahead of time, then he goes to this beautiful wood shop he's got. Oh my golly, it's a gorgeous setup. And he's retired as a cabinet maker, and he's got the most beautiful shop now and just knocks out these pieces. So again, I really appreciate it. Out of Chico Black Walnut. And I just was thinking the other day, really, I think a program on Chico's black walnut trees would be a good one there because they're fading. There's not a lot of them left here. At one time they were enormously prevalent here in Chico. They had been purposely planted there for decades, beginning very probably with John Bidwell himself, who liked to carry around a pocket full of black walnuts. and just stick them in the ground as he went around it through his daily life. And they turned out to be wonderfully beautiful trees for the wood that could be had from cutting them down. And of course, several very large, the most prominent American gun makers for decades came to Chico to get the black walnut for their gun stocks. And it said that boxcar loads of Chico black walnut would go out of Chico there all over the world. And so again, it's beautiful wood, and they're fading, and they're still beautiful trees with still a handful of beauties around. So
Excuse
again,
me just 1 minute.
Yeah.
What I'd like to add to that is Mr. Dave and Betty Noble, years ago, bought this black walnut. It had been stored in the garage for a long time. And the desk and the podium and this and other places it is are all donated by Mr. Noble and Mrs. Noble. So thank you, Dave, for that.
Betty and I bought, along with 2 other young people, long ago, I think probably 1980, we bought a warehouse full of big slabs of black walnut from a Chico tree trimmer and tree worker there. And so I had this grand vision, yeah, I'll be a woodworker. Yeah, right. Never made one thing. We've got still a beautiful batch of black walnut, and I'm so pleased to see someone with the design and fabrication talent like Dusty step in here and use that wood. So great. I also want to thank Tammy. And she, again, Tammy Lyon, another board member that just week after month after year keeps the outside of this beautiful museum building looking so nice, clean, wrestling with the problems that come up out there with people and their behavior, not always very accommodating. And Tammy is often the one that has to clean up after the messes that seem to appear on our steps, our stairway, and right to the base of the stairway there as people use those spaces. So again, really appreciate your work, all of your contributions. So I guess really that's probably enough thanks there. Again, I think, yes, I don't want to forget to thank our presenter last week, Sean Keene, and our presenter this week, Gabrielle Culbertson, as 2 volunteers that have been here at the museum over the last 6 months to a year and have really stepped right in and taken a real interest and done some real research and come up with some great programs. The program last week on Pioneer Days by Sean was very good, and the commentary from the audience there as people who remember there were a handful, quite a sprinkling of people, including myself, who can remember the Pioneer Day events here, right here in Chico. So that was so good after Sean's presentation to hear the commentary and the remembrances out of the audience. And so this week we've got another great program put together by Gabrielle. She was originally from Portland, went to school at Western Washington University, got a degree in cultural anthropology, and after years working in Portland, her hometown, she came down to Chico here and has been here for about a year. She is applying for graduate school now, and I would expect that will probably begin to fall in place, and off she'll go away from Chico. But again, it's been great to have her here, and she took a special interest here in this topic, the story of the Black community here in the Sacramento Valley, and done some great research, talked to a number of Chico researchers and people who had information, really done a nice job. Today, Gabrielle works at Chico State, and we'll see where she goes from here. But I think I'm going to turn this over to Gabrielle Culbertson, and we'll have our program from her.
Hi everyone, thank you for the introduction. Thank you guys all for being here today for this really important talk on the Black history. We're going to be mostly focusing here in Chico and talking about the early settlers and the important figures that made this town what it is today. So first, to give us some historical context, we're going to talk about why Black African Americans moved here to Chico. The first record of Black people arriving in California was in the 18th century. They arrived as slaves brought by the Spanish after the Spanish conquered California. A few remained after that date, but most worked as farmers or laborers. With the start of the gold rush in 1848, African Americans traveled to the West Coast in a bid for wealth and freedom that could be afforded by panning for gold. White Southerners were also lured by the idea of gold and brought slaves to California in order to work the mines starting in 1849. Chico was officially founded in 1860, but prior to that, African Americans were among the pioneers and first settlers of the Chico Township as early as 1850. The second wave of migration came in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation that outlawed slavery in the United States. People chose California because Northern California were Union supporters, and that attracted many Black Southerners to the state. California had played a part in the Union effort by providing money through their gold mines and supplying over 17,000 soldiers that helped push the Confederate Army out of Arizona and New Mexico. Even though the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 outlawed slavery, many chose to leave and try their fortunes in other states in the U.S. Unfortunately, even though slavery was outlawed, the process was slow in liberating enslaved people in southern states. Once freed, slave owners created unfair contracts with their former slaves. These contracts had unclear language wherein violations were common. Thus, the slave owners could choose to dissolve the contract, but commonly chose to fine their employees around $5 to $10. Most were unable to pay, and that led to convict leasing, where prison terms could be bought by the previous slave owner, and they were forced to work and no longer received payment for that work. So many Black Southerners left the South seeing these unfair practices and migrated to other parts of the U.S. But even now that slavery was outlawed, jobs were restricted and pay was low and discrimination was still high. Some of the first settlers here in Chico was Matilda Henshaw. She was brought over by her former slave owners. She was a domestic servant to the Henshaw family and arrived in Chico from Virginia when she was just 10 years old. She settled here in Chico. Another one was Joseph Tatham. He was also brought by his slave owners in 1950. He remained in Chico even after the death of his slave-owning family and worked as a laborer. William McEwen arrived in 1855 at 15 years old from Missouri. He worked many different jobs here in Chico and was able to purchase a home where he lived with his wife Harriet. And James Price arrived in 1860. He was a blacksmith and craftsman. He lived in a boarding house provided by J.C. Morrill's pioneer lumber operation. It is unclear why, but he left by 1870, probably due to discrimination. S.W. Swepson, or Cato Swepson, was born a free man in New York, and he joined the New York's 43rd Colored Regiment of the 4th Edition, 9th Army Corps. After serving in the Civil War, he arrived here in Chico and worked as a teamster for Sierra Lumber Company before passing away at a young age. And William Lee served under the General Lee family, where he was a slave, but even after being free, he remained as a house servant in Virginia. He came to Chico and worked as a barber between West 2nd and Broadway. Unfortunately, all we have on these people are their names and their occupations. We do not know much more about their lives, and that is an unfortunate tragedy that we're hoping to remedy. After these residents became established in Chico, more African Americans moved into the area, comforted by the presence that was here. I'm going to take a moment to talk about some of these important figures to Chico's history. One is Peter Powers. We are lucky in that Peter Powers wrote his own biography about his life and time here in Chico and before. He arrived in Northern California in 1857 after winning his own freedom and buying the freedom of his wife. He had converted the slave owner's family, and on his deathbed, the slave owner gave him his freedom papers. His wife's slave owner would not let her go and made a requirement that he had to have at least 2 witnesses sign off before her freedom was granted. Peter knew that that would not be possible even with 2 signatures. So he went to the 4 wealthiest men in his town and got them to sign off on the papers, and he traveled here with his first wife, headed for California. They arrived originally in Marysville, where he worked for the Mount Olive Baptist Church. He then helped establish a church and schoolhouse in Red Bluff, but after his wife passed away, him and his children moved to Chico. When he arrived, he noticed the lack of church and school for the children of color. There was a rule at the time that you had to have at least 10 students to qualify for a classroom. So he grabbed as many students as he could and had the first ever classroom out of his own house, where he taught them the alphabet and how to read and write. He then petitioned the city trustees to establish a school and to fund for a teacher. During his time in Chico, he had many different jobs. He worked as a city bill poster, a calcimer, a whitewasher. He owned a fruit stand at one point. But it was his job as a city bill poster that allowed him to have connections to the social network and political movements here in Chico. And he used that information to help petition for more rights for the black citizens that lived here. By 1870, Powers had organized a board of trustees to establish a church. And by 1875, he had also established a chapter of Black Masons and Black fraternity orders. He was the first black man to hold the position as the worshipful master for the West Coast, and was the first black man to be appointed as chief deputy for the Independent Order of God, and was the first ever black man to hold that position. His second wife was also equally important to Chico. She was the matriarch of the community. She had come to Chico during a cross-country trip with her family that owned her from Montgomery. They took her along to San Francisco and to Hawaii and back to San Francisco. When she returned, she met Thomas M. Jackson, who was living in Chico at the time, and he convinced her to stay and not return with her slave-owning family. She met Peter Powers, and they got married. She, in her position as the matriarch and her relation to Peter, was able to support other women in the community. She helped them establish homes here in Chico, get involved with labor markets, and she hosted social events for the neighborhood at her home on 7th Street. She also hosted the first group of black students at Chico State when they needed a place to stay because no other dorms would let them live there. Another important figure is Peter Jackson. He was different than the others as he was born a free man in Brooklyn, New York. He arrived in San Francisco in 1858, where he met and married a woman from the Feather River Rancheria. Unfortunately for that time, her name was never recorded and we don't have any information about her. He arrived in Chico in 1864 and established his barbershop, the Chico Barber and Shaving Saloon. He ran the business for over 40 years and it was extremely popular. His estimated net worth in 1914 was over $120,000. Jackson helped organize the black community to petition for the church upon his arrival. He used his own funds from the saloon to help buy building materials for the church. He also used his position as an influential member of society to support his community and increase visibility and solidarity among the black residents. In 1869, he created a prospective voters list, and it became one of the most accurate censuses of black residents for Chico. Voting was extremely important to him, and making sure that the residents' voices were heard in all political matters was a campaign that he championed. He started hosting educational classes at the church and literacy lessons so that other residents who might not have been able to read could pass the literacy test to vote. He was also the sexton of the AME Church and created the Convention of the Colored People at the church. And it was a voting bloc that pushed for black issues and established fraternities and social societies. A couple examples were the Knights of Pythias and the North Star Lodge. He also was very big on desegregating schools and making sure that his children had equal access to education. By the 1870s, members of the community started to establish businesses and integrate themselves into the labor market. Some of the most common establishments were bootblack stands or shoe shining parlors. They were the first businesses that black residents were able to fully own themselves and operate. One stand was owned by the Daly family, and it was located at the Park Hotel on West Broadway. The Williams family owned the other one on Main Street. Barbershops were also able to be bought and purchased. Peter Jackson owned one saloon for 40 years, and it was on Wall Street. The Daly family was able to purchase a saloon as well, and they opened it on Broadway. There was also a beauty parlor that was open in 2 rooms of a house that serviced primarily women in the community, but unfortunately I was unable to find any names of the woman who ran it, except for the fact that she was from Philadelphia. One of the easiest labor markets for them to enter was working at barbers or saloons, so a lot of the people and names that I found were barbers for the community. Many different families owned or processed trash services during the establishment of the Chico Township. Most notably were Peter Powers, Sam T. Freeman, and Heidi Davis. Davis was different as he was able to procure a contract with the city and was able to collect all trash and debris, and that made him one of the wealthiest men in the town. There was also a cafe opened on Main Street that was opened by Clarence Smith, which served as a hangout spot for all the local teens and young children. And of course, the main labor fields that people were allowed to enter were laundry services, domestic labor, and manual labor. Now, there was a black neighborhood here in Chico, and it was located between 6th and Wall and 7th and Flume. I've included some spots here. So on number 1, we have the Summers house. The Summers were the pastors of the AME Church. We also have the French's house, Cato Swepson's home, and Peter Jackson's home. And this kind of outlines the boundary of where the neighborhood was for homes. And if you'll notice at number 5 was the AME Church. Most of the homes congregated around that church as it was very central to the community. And I also wanted to highlight where these businesses were. I think we tend to forget that black people owned businesses here and were on our main streets as early as the 1800s. So we have the Daly's Barbershop, which was on Main Street, the Boot Black Stand, which was also on Main Street, and the second barbershop, which was on Broadway. Now on to the education and desegregation of schools. As I mentioned before, Peter Powers established a black schoolhouse upon his arrival. He petitioned the board after teaching 10 students in his house for weeks. They were able to get their first teacher. The first teacher of the school was Jenny Costar. Unfortunately, instructors were paid $15 less than the women who taught white students, so they constantly had teachers revolving throughout their schoolhouse. In 1870, California passed a law stating that if a school district enrolled more than 10 African American, they must be taught in a separate schoolhouse. Unfortunately, there were less than 10 students, so by 1871, the Colored Convention chapter called for an end to school segregation. The white residents strongly objected to this integration, despite the fact that it was illegal. So a separate school was established. With nowhere to house the students, they ended up housing them at the AME Church, which was good for the church in some ways. It helped generate income because the Board of Trustees had to pay them for housing the students. But by 1876, the effects of the Depression meant that the school board could no longer pay for the separate building. So despite the outrage from the citizens, they voted to integrate. Despite these efforts, black students were still unable to go to school due to their forced entry into the labor market at a young age. And when they did arrive at school, they were bullied or cast out from their other students and were not allowed to join any social organizations or sports teams. Talking about the importance of the AME Church, I've mentioned it a couple times in my lecture. The AME Church was dedicated on June 25th, 1870. Before that, the members of the congregation met for 10 years in Hall and in Peter Powers' homes until they organized for a church building. Peter Powers stepped in as a pastor from time to time, and so did Cornelius Daly. From 1870 to 1925, it was known as the Bethel AME of Chico. The founding of the AME Church is very interesting. It was through the combined efforts of Claiborne Jones, Peter Powers, and Peter Jackson, who used Claiborne Jones' relationship to John Bidwell to petition and meet with him for a church. Thankfully, it was Susan Anthony's relationship with Annie Bidwell that got them the church in the first place. Bidwell had turned them down when they first asked. So Susan went to Annie and petitioned for the church. And Annie talked to John, and they got the church. The church was a community meeting center for all of the black residents, and by October 1887, there were 83 church members in Chico. The black Chicoans could meet and communicate with each other there without suspicion or harassment. They also used the facility to teach literacy to different adults. Howard Carey, who was a white deputy, came every night to teach different members of the community how to read and how to write. The Methodist Episcopal Church South was given to the AME congregation in 1908 and moved to the site of the original AME church. This was due to an exchange for the current lot that it was situated on. So the original church building no longer exists at this time, and the one that we see is the Methodist Episcopal Church. At this church, they also started the Emancipation celebrations, which went on every year from 1871. Here are a couple of the organizations that the black Chicoans started here in Chico. Many of these were fraternal organizations, and they differed from the white fraternal organizations because women were allowed to join. There's the Black Knights of Pythias, the Black Masons, the Lone Butte Lodge Oddfellows, and the Garfield Literary Society, where different members of the community can meet up, discuss books, politics, literature. There was a Black Bicycle Club. It was dangerous for them to ride bikes alone through the town, so they would meet up as a group and ride to other people's houses to have dinner and celebrations. They also had the Convention of Colored People, which was a voting bloc, an educational committee which pushed for the desegregation of schools, and a scholastic league where black students could participate in sports and other social clubs outside of the school. I'm going to talk a little bit about Susan Anthony and Claiborne Jones, the people behind getting the funding for the church. Susan was sent on a cross-country trip as a servant of Annie Bidwell at the age of 19. When she arrived in Chico, she met and married her husband, Claiborne Jones, later that year. She was Annie's personal servant and was forced to accompany Annie to events up until her death. Because of her service to Annie, she was given a sewing machine and became a seamstress who was well respected in the community. She was also gifted the organ for the church and played the music during services, which became highly regarded. She, like many other black servants of the Bidwells, were highly valued and worked long hours for minimal pay. Claiborne Jones arrived ahead of Annie from the Kennedy family in 1868. He was born in Virginia before being sold to the Kennedy family. He worked as a servant and laborer for Bidwell, where he met his wife. He married Susan in June of 1868, and after petitioning Bidwell, got a house built for them on 7th and Flume. After he arrived, he quickly joined the AME's church board of trustees alongside Peter Powers and Peter Jackson, and would use his relationship to Bidwell to understand political maneuverings in this town, to petition for homes, and to kind of support the community. The Daly family was another established family here in Chico. Cornelius Daly was a barber who bought a new home that was large enough to accommodate the congregation on 319 Broadway. He served as a pastor for many years and worked as a bootblack as well. They hosted cookouts for the AME church and for the residents of Butte County at his home. And Louise was very important to this entire cause. She was the woman who helped raise funds for the church to keep it afloat in times of economic uncertainty. She organized church socials, Sunday school performances, and a concert in 1884 that drew attention from the city. She unfortunately passed at a young age of 32, but her daughter-in-law took up her mantle. Ruby was the most trusted servant of Annie and was with her on her deathbed. She accompanied Annie everywhere in her last years and participated heavily in the church and organizing social events, like her mother-in-law, Louise, before her. George Daly followed in his father's footsteps and was able to open up a barbershop alongside Peter Jackson. He was able to purchase multiple businesses, including a bootblack stand, and bought his house. It was very well noted for its nice wood flooring, and he was very proud to continue his father's legacy and build generational wealth for his family. He also owned property on Flume Street and rented out rooms to many other residents. Some other notable community members. One was the French family, who were very prominent in the black neighborhood. They work primarily as laborers, and they have the largest collection of photos that we see of black residents. Unfortunately, a French family, somebody had a camera, and they love to take photos. And that is Amelia French right there in that very beautiful gown. The Summers family was a family of pastors that moved in, that supported the AME Church, and also participated in all of the voting rights and literacy clubs. Sam T. Freeman was an orator and political commentator from Kansas who was active in petitioning for black rights in Chico. He was very politically aware and voted for liberal politicians, but was a bit eccentric, and famously gave a lecture on Christian sciences during an AME event in Armory Hall. He worked on the Lusk farm as a teamster and was heavily involved in the secret societies and literary circles of black Chicoans. He also was the founder of the Bicycle Club. Clarence Smith was popular in the early 1900s. He opened a small cafe on Main Street and offered music lessons to black students. He cooked for the cafe, but knew that he could not be the face of it. So he had hired white waitresses to appease the Chico residents. He had learned how to play jazz guitar at a young age and would have the neighborhood children come in after close so that they could listen to jazz music for the first time and learn how to play instruments. Heidi Davis ran the trash service and was the richest black man in Chico. By the time of his death, he had 2 horse-drawn wagons and rented out multiple properties. Socially, white Chicoans did not associate with the black community members. Minstrel shows were common, and the harassment of the black population through degrading language was almost encouraged. The Chico Record was especially antagonistic toward the black Chicoans and took joy in posting violent ideologies and statements about the residents. George Crozet, the editor, was heavily involved in this. He would go as far as to accuse other members of the society of being mixed race, causing them grief and anguish as they were turned on by their fellow residents. White residents also instructed their children to stay away from the integrated black students and turned a blind eye when the children harassed and attacked black residents outside of the church. Many of the town's citizens had migrated from the South and continued their prejudices and beliefs about the subhuman treatment of black community members. Due to this, they faced a lot of adversity. Segregation was heavily enforced in the community. Hotel Oaks, Max Cafe, and Price's Place were white-only establishments. Employment was hard to come by, and black women were only able to work as domestics. Black men were limited to maintenance, janitors, cooks, waiters, and porters. There's a story that Thomas Fleming tells of a young girl who learned how to be a secretary and went to school. She showed up at the Diamond Match Company ready for her first day, and her grandfather, George Daly, was so excited to take her in. She was of mixed race. Dr. Moulton had slept with her mother and then had paid off a man to pretend to be her father. When the Diamond Match Company realized that she was of mixed ancestry, they turned her away at the door and told her not to come back. People in the town were rightfully outraged and went to Dr. Moulton, wondering if he would stand up for his granddaughter, but he did not. Black students were banned from joining sports teams and student or social organizations. And areas of town were blocked off as white trade only to ban black residents from buying land in those regions. The Mansion Park neighborhood specifically refused to show houses to black residents. At the start of the 20th century, things had changed a little bit. By 1910, the black population in Chico was around 65 people. With frustration due to the promises that were made in the Reconstruction era, a lot of black residents left Chico to go further south or to populations with more black people. The community did become more established, and black Chicoans were able to finally own their own homes. The neighborhood was fully established from 6th and Flume to 7th and Wall, and schools had become fully integrated. But most students did not continue on after middle school due to economic uncertainty. Employment was still rigidly separated by race, and women were especially restricted to only domestic work. But at the end of World War I and the establishment of NAACP, it brought to the forefront issues of discrimination in the United States. When these soldiers returned from the war, they were dismayed to find that they were still not given the same opportunities as their white counterparts who were allowed into veteran circles. Then, with NAACP and black newspapers and magazines began circulating, and people started to question what rights they were owed in this country, and started having these conversations, specifically in Northern California. Since they were so isolated in Northern California, African American residents really established county-wide social events and clubs to stay connected and to pass along political information. The Scholastic League, like I mentioned, was established between Chico, Oroville, Marysville, Sacramento, Red Bluff, and Redding, so that students could compete in sports and bands. Chico also was the house of all the national black fraternal organizations, so people would travel from out of town to attend these socials. It was also selected as the place to host the Emancipation Day, which was on January 1st every year and would always draw a large crowd. Here are a couple examples of such of these events being hosted. One was a tin wedding, which is a 10-year anniversary wedding, that was hosted here in Chico with the Summers family as the reverend doing the ceremony. Another was an entertainment in Armory Hall, where white people attended and the money went to the church. There was music, there was an orator, and there was a bunch of dances, things of that nature. Thankfully, we have someone who recorded all the information on what life was like here in Chico in the early 1900s. Thomas Fleming spent his time here from 1906 to 1923 and wrote extensively about his adolescence growing up in Chico. So I'm going to give you all a moment to read some of his words because nobody can describe it better than him. Yes, of course. He describes Chico in this statement. Every house in Chico had at least one citrus tree in its yard, oranges, grapefruit, and tangerines, plus rows of roses or other flowering plants. He mentions that another man, Herman Clark, came to town who played a decent piano. Others who joined us were Sandy Hatton, who was a catcher on the Marysville High School baseball team and played drums, and George Raymond, who played trombone at the Colusa High School band. We used to get together on many weekends in one of the cities where each lived. He talks about the African Methodist Episcopal Church. There was one black church in town, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which had a steady membership of 25 or 30. Church was held every other week because the congregation shared a minister with another town. He also talks about the rights with women. Like almost every black woman in Chico, Mama worked as a domestic for a white family. It was very tiring because she had to keep the house clean, do the laundry, and cook the meals. She worked 10 hours a day easily. Domestics received such low wages, I don't think Mama ever earned over $45 a month. Although the population in Chico was smaller than at the end of the 19th century, the community ties had gotten stronger. The church was still an epicenter of the community, but black businesses had established themselves to also become meeting places and settings for political action. Younger children were able to cross over racial lines to build friendships, and black students were allowed to participate or create their own clubs and sports, even though they were not sanctioned by the school. Black Chicoans were able to build generational wealth and had established themselves as a collective and a protective force. They laid the groundwork for the first black students at Chico State and for the access for black children to gain new opportunities and move into new career fields. Despite the troubled history that California may have with its black residents, people were able to find community here and to build a life for them and their children. Their histories are often forgotten when we talk about the founding of these towns, but these people participated and made Chico what it is today. Some sources. And I wanted to say a quick thank you, a very humble thank you to Michelle Shover and Robert Sherrard, whose work is a foundation for all records of black history in the Sacramento Valley. And a thank you to Liz Stewart, who compiled and saved thousands of articles about these historical figures and graciously shared sources with me. Thank you to Jennifer Wood, who researched with me and supported my endeavors. And thank you to the Chico History Museum, specifically to Dave and Betty Nopel, who encouraged me and supported my desire to share this information with the public. And I have one last statement for you guys before I'll take questions. Oftentimes in history, we tend to ignore the diverse history of this nation and our towns. We now have the chance to change the status quo and to tell the stories so often forgotten. My work is the culmination of people, both past and present, who have dedicated their lives to remembering and honoring the history of those who are purposefully forgotten. The change starts here, now, with all of you. I encourage you to continue the work that was started and to remember the people who came before and helped build this town. If you or your families have photos or materials of these people's histories, I would love to connect and help pass their stories on to the next generation. I'll leave you all with one of my favorite quotes. "The world is before you, and you need not take it or leave it as it was when you came in," by James Baldwin. Thank you all so much for your time today. Are there any questions? Yes.
Could you tell a little more about Thomas Fleming? Because he's an interesting figure. A lot of people don't really know.
Yes, of course. So Thomas Fleming arrived in Chico at a young age, and he went through most of his middle school and high school here. He then learned how to write and became very interested in the status of life, and went on to become a famous reporter in San Francisco. He has won many, many awards and changed the perspective of how we thought about Black history in the northern state. He also attended Chico State here for a time before he left, chased out by members of the citizens of this town. He had worked for the local newspaper at Chico State and had done a lot of writing for them. And he had been outwardly against a lynching that had happened further south. Because of this, some of the students at the school were very angry by his public outcry for it, and threatened that they were going to come and lynch him as well. Because his time here was so tumultuous, he ended up not finishing with his degree and moved back to San Francisco. It ended up working out for him. He helped fund one of the first Black publications in California and won many, many awards for his work in journalism. Yes?
Do you have much or any information about I guess, contact between Native American issues and peoples that were here at the time? Or did they intermarry, or?
From my understanding, there were a couple marriages. Unfortunately, because of the way this town was set up, not a lot of the Native Americans were recorded in any of the censuses or recorded in any of the directories, so we cannot know for certain what their names were. We only have stories that people tell. There were laborers that worked with them alongside on Bidwell's ranch, but typically most of the people that were Black that worked there were working inside the house and were training other servants. That is as much as we know, unfortunately.
Well, Peter Powers' son married a Native American. And I want to put a pitch in for Stansbury House.
Yes.
Because if you go to the second floor up there, there's a beautiful dark wine-colored wedding dress. And the label there says Mrs. Powers, and 1880s. There were 3 Mrs. Powers who married within a 10-year period. And, we're looking to find somebody who might know who donated that dress to the Stansbury House. Not to put them down, but sometimes records get, they get put into a place where it's hard to find them. And I would love to know if there are people, because Peter Powers' son died at a very young age. He and his wife had only been married 10 or 11 months. We don't know if that was her wedding dress. It could have been Peter Powers' second marriage, or it could have been a later marriage of his. So there are 3 different women who could have worn that dress, if it's correct.
We are also looking for the cornerstone of the AME Church, so if any of you guys know anyone or have any stories, it is a very important piece of our cultural history that they are hoping to get back. Yes?
Could you please put your slide back on the other sources?
Yeah, of course.
So leave it there for a moment.
Oh, sorry.
So much. Wonderful research, thank you.
Of course, yes.
Evidently, Crosette, who managed the Chico record, was a real, how can you say it, very conservative, as opposed to the other paper, the Enterprise, which was the other way, I gather. So whatever happened to Crosset and his feelings about the black folks and anybody else that was disadvantaged?
Well, we know that at one point, when I believe it was the elevator man who worked at the building passed away, he did attend the funeral service and then did not say anything about it for a while. But after a month, his harassment continued. I don't know how long he served. He was not the focal point of a lot of my research. I purposely chose not to include any of the horrible language that was used against the black community, as I wanted this to be a celebration of their history and their celebrations and what they were able to accomplish. But there is stuff out there that you can find. One was the naming of a slough that was out here that was named very offensive names. And there are a couple of his articles that still circulate around. You can look through the archives, through the record.
It's curious to me that the Methodist Episcopal Church South, which were made up of Southerners, became the AME Church.
They just moved church buildings because the Southern Methodists ended up they merged with the Northern Methodist Church.
And what year was that roughly?
1900s, I believe, like 1905, 1904.
So they stayed at church, the Southern Methodists here, for 50 years. Still fighting the war.
Yes, there was still like a very divide between those who came from the north and those who came from the south, especially because Chico had supported the Union effort. And the gold that was found in the mines here were used as money, and people's sons had served in the Civil War. Cato Swepson had served in the Civil War as well. So it was a bit of a tumultuous time between the citizens as well, but I think they all banded together as time went on, as their spaces were encroached by other more diverse crowds, such as the Chinese moving in. So I think they all kind of banded together against the outsiders and really bonded over their shared histories of their cultural background. Yes?
Were there any notable black publications, like from any of the literary societies, or any like ongoing texts that were like beyond some of these other more, of course, the racist ones?
Unfortunately, not that I could find. I don't know if any of that information was preserved. I'd imagine there was some. There were a couple snippets that were found in the Weekly Enterprise and a couple that were written by members themselves, which is what we have. And a lot of the research that was done by Michelle Chauver and Robert Sherrard was based off of audio clippings from some of these members. But I don't know if there's any written historical that is left over or if it's been preserved by anyone or their families.
More oral histories.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Of course. Yes.
Did you find any evidence of black cowboys?
Yes, I did. There's a photo. So there is a story that somebody shared about these group of black cowboys who put on a performance, and Jesse Stahl was an amazing cowboy. They banned him from competing in events with white cowboys because he embarrassed them with his cool tricks and showmanship. And they traveled in a troupe, and they were from the Northern California area and went up and down. There's also a couple evidence of black people owning farms, but that didn't happen until later in the 19th century. The 19th century and the 20th century, as they were not allowed to own that much property here in the Chico Township, besides a couple of houses. Yes.
In the year 2000, I did a project to interview my father and his siblings, still with us at the time. And they're started out with a humble dairy farm, just like so many farmers here in the valley. And they went up to get to the Diamond National store up in Red Bluff, I believe it was. And so that was in the 1920s. And one of my uncles said that's the first time he had ever seen a black person. So I just kind of asked questions in a free-flowing form to see what would, produce. And that just sat with me because there was lack of, education's exposure. And he was just, it was in his memory very solidly, that first encounter, just as a anecdotal information. And they were working in the lumber mill there, at least a few of them. I also wanted to ask the question, do you know of any Juneteenth activities that are going to go on this weekend, or particularly on Monday?
Yes, I know there's going to be one at DeGarmo Park. There's going to be performances, and there's going to be some food and artisanal things that you can purchase.
At DeGarmo Park? Thank you.
Of course.
Monday?
Yes, Monday. All right, well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate you all coming out.